that existed in the area. Here is our sort of assessment of the poor areas that the buildings were on. So you can see this area was pretty much unbuildable because this is where the creek was, but this is actually, you can see the majority of the homes were built right over this land. And this was an initial schematic design that we had where we allowed the water to percolate up. We opened that creek up again and provided for sort of a public amenity in an area that really had been ignored by the city for decades. This was a community-based project, so most of our work was done in conjunction with community meetings, participatory design. Here you see one of the larger meetings where the entire neighborhood had been brought, or the entire community had been brought together to sort of discuss some of the ideas that we were moving forward with. We really worked with a smaller representative group for a longer period of time from each one of the neighborhoods in the area. And ultimately, this was the result of that work. And you can see here that area that had been populated by homes had been opened up to a greenway. We had proposed a lake, a green parkway that ran from one side of the city to the other. And there are a bunch of other things here that I won't go into, but you can sort of see how we've moved from one typology, one sort of land use to another. These are the homes that were there before the public housing units came in. This was quote unquote considered blighted areas, but you can see it's an intact fabric of neighborhood and community. These were some of the ideas for post-housing in the area to sort of echo back to that time when there was a community there and there was a sort of a strong aesthetic in the neighborhood. Ultimately, the project was given the go-ahead, and so we went from this to this. This process took about 20 years, but it started with neighbors, the residents actually owning their agency and saying, you know, enough is enough. We need you to address some very real concerns in this neighborhood, and we're not going to stop until you do. So this is actually one of my favorite pictures of the area, because in the process of creating this, you know, some of these things was suggested by community residents that anybody who moves here in the future won't know that struggle. They won't know that, you know, how we got to this point. As part of the negotiations, the residents had right of first refusal. So they weren't gentrified out. They had an opportunity to come back into the neighborhood once it had been redesigned. And so they wanted people to be able to know that this was a fight. It just didn't happen. And so you can see they sort of chiseled their fight into stone. Here's another project that we did. It was very small, quick. This was done in Detroit. I don't know if you know about the Detroit itself, but you can fit the entire city of Boston, San Francisco, and Manhattan in the square footage of Detroit. That's how large the city is. And so the bus system here, public transportation system here is, let's just say, leaves a lot to be desired. Sometimes people wait 2.5 hours, sometimes 3 hours on a bus to get to where they're going. It's very difficult to figure out how to get to work on time, to get to school on time, to get to your doctor's appointments on time. So there's a lot of time poverty in the city. So a lot of time that's just wasted waiting on public transportation. And while you wait, there isn't really a very pleasant place for you to be. You can see people are just left standing on the sidewalk where the bus stops are. They either sit on the ground, they congregate in very large groups, which are, post-COVID won't necessarily be allowed. Again, they sit on the ground. Sometimes they are given places to sit that really don't even have seats. So it's a problem. Here are some of the conditions. I don't really want to go through those at small time. Also during this time, the city was in the process of tearing down, the program was 2,000 homes every year for 10 years. That is the process. So you can imagine there's a lot of debris, a lot of materials going into landfill, and this is just some of the research that we did on how much was going in landfill and how much of that was going to turn into, you know, problematic gas, expand land dumps around the city. So, you know, we can't do anything about the buses, not as designers. We can do something as citizens. We can protest and we can push, and we did those things. But as designers, we figured, well, maybe we can try these two things together. So what we decided was that we were going to try to salvage as many of the doors as possible, because that's a large container of gas when it falls apart. And we would try to get as many salvageable materials from the buildings that were being torn down, from the homes being torn down, studs, bolts, anything that we could find. And we were going to try to use that to at least create a humane place for people to wait on the bus. So we put a proposal into the National Endowment of the Arts. They gave us some funds. We hired artists. We brought doors in. We rented out a place to sort of do our construction, and we went to work. We would go around the city. We had to do this early in the morning under the cover of darkness, because what we were doing in a sense was somewhat illegal. And we went around and we just installed these units in places where there were large congregations of people waiting for buses that had a history of running late. And we made them, we didn't attach them to the ground, because we wanted people to actually be able to move them if they felt that, okay, this bus is now running faster and we don't really need this, but we need it over here in this neighborhood because these buses are running slowly. And we just installed them around the city, and people took them to heart. As a matter of fact, these were actually installed at a bus stop, and they were moved next to a homeless shelter. And so now the folks had a place to gather in the city where they didn't have before. So this was yet another way of, in a sense, trying to build justice into an unjust landscape. But I also operate on some other platforms as well. Typically, I do a lot of writing. And I write about sort of justice issues, spatial issues, racial issues, particularly through architecture, in architecture. So I've written a few books. Some were directed to students, some primarily to professionals. I've written a number of essays and chapters in books by other folks or in journals, primarily addressing academics and educators. But recently I've been trying to write more for the general public, because I think all these areas, the academic side, the professional side, and the general public have to understand the terms and conditions of what makes for a just environment. I also do it in my teaching, that I have a seminar that is focused primarily on design, activism, and social justice. And I also have a studio that is about activist architecture that thinks about trying to be proactive in addressing social issues rather than sort of reactive, which is kind of the way we are right now. And also, but that's not the only place I ran. So 2006 to 2014, I ran a community design center. I already mentioned that. One of the reasons that I think we have a very unjust landscape, at least here in the United States, is that there is a lack of BIPOC people in the profession. Depending on what number you look at, there are about 250,000 registered architects in the United States. Some of them have been granted from other locations. Any one time you can have between 200 and 250,000, but there are right now 2,300 registered African-American architects in the United States. So our numbers run somewhere, depending on, again, what numbers you run, 2 and 3% in the entire profession. And this number has stayed consistent for the last 50 years. So it's not surprising that, you know, we have these conditions in the urban environment that don't respond very well to issues of equity and social justice, because that's not on the agenda for a lot of people in the profession. So one of the ways I try to address that is to acknowledge that there are not a lot of people, not a lot of students understand or know that architecture is a possibility for them. So at the Design Center, we created a high school program. We ran for 8 years. We got some funding, again, from the National Endowment of the Arts. And the program was designed to basically introduce architecture as a possible career choice, not only to the students, but to their parents. Their parents are really, in some ways, less inspired by architects, because they don't know anybody who's an architect. They prefer their children to be doctors, the lawyers, or engineers, or accountants. So, you know, it's also an educational process for the parents as well. That program spawned another program, actually two, at the University of Michigan. One where students actually go to school for half a day for an entire semester. They get architecture, or they get college and high school credit for the program. So those who go into architecture actually start the game, they hit the ground running because they understand, you know, what's expected of them. And they also have credits to apply to their matriculation, which is also very important because lots of students, lots of BIPOC students don't have the financial wares to stay in school for 7 or 8 years, perhaps without working, or perhaps without. So anytime you can cut down on the time that you have to spend in school, it's very useful. There's another program, but these were institutional programs. These were based in schools. There are other efforts that are not institutionalized at all, which are, I think, are very, very important because they allow you to be a little bit more radical in the things that you want to do. And you're not dependent on trying to follow, you know, some particular institutional rule. This young lady started this program called 400 Forward. There are less than 500 women who are actually registered African-American registered architects in the United States. She was the 400th. And so she started this 400 Forward to address, you know, BIPOC issues for women in architecture. The National Organization of Minority Architects has now Project Pipeline, which is a week-long camp that happens in every chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects in the summertime, as a way, again, to sort of expose people to the field, but also to develop mentorships that will help students in the long run. If they decide they want to go into the program, they have somebody they can call, they have somebody they can bounce ideas off of. Mentorship is very important to support people once they're in this program or in the field itself. And then this is one you might be familiar with. It's the Hip Hop Architecture Camp. It works similarly to the NOMA program, where there are camps that go on for a week in other locations around the United States. And it's a way to use the tenets and the interest of hip hop architecture or hip hop to invite people into a world of the built environment. If you really listen to some of the hip hop lyrics, they really talk about their environment. They talk about their environment a lot. And so this is something that kids can, that they relate to. They relate to fairly easily and fairly quickly, even when they don't know it's about the environment. They understand, my neighborhood is in a way similar to what this person is talking about. So it's actually a very successful program, and it is funded and underwritten by Autodesk. So it's pretty cool. And then there are also programs that are just completely not institutionalized at all, that are working towards issues of justice in the built environment. There is a Dark Matter University, which is actually creating a curriculum that they go and they teach or co-teach with other institutions. that deal with sort of racial and spatial injustice. And then there's Black Space as well. Both of those places you can find on the web if you're interested in it, and you can see the number of people who are involved. They have academics, they have professionals, they have community organizers, they have developers, they have sociologists that are all involved in sort of trying to create a intersectional, more multidisciplinary curriculum that can be delivered, that encompasses all these things that have to be dealt with when you're talking about racial and spatial injustice. And so hopefully I made my 10 or 20 minutes, and I thank you for your time.
Craig, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I'm very much looking forward to engaging on some of these topics that you've mentioned in our panel discussion. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Wandile Mthiyane. Wandile Mthiyane is an Obama leader, Tedx Fellow, architectural designer, social entrepreneur, and the founder and CEO of Ubuntu Design Group. Ubuntu Design Group is an architectural organization that focuses on social impact design projects ranging from individual housing to urban design scale. Influenced by his childhood experiences growing up in a post-apartheid South Africa, Wandile founded UDG on the core idea that if apartheid architecture could be used to segregate and oppress, then community-led design should liberate and enable opportunities for all. UDG developed the concept of Ubuntu Home, a dignified work-live home designed to enable the families to financially sustain themselves as well as to empower the local community. Mthiyane is also a founder and director of the Ubuntu Architecture Summer Abroad, an intercollegiate educational experience in which students learn a community-centered approach to impacting large communities by designing and building dignified and culturally influenced housing for resilient families. In 2017, UDG built their pilot project for a low-income Durban-based family also struggling to live in their current dwelling with a disability. This inspired the designers of UDG to develop the unique model in a way that would facilitate future projects, more public and private companies. The power of the model is in the transformative programs that would make quality housing more accessible by providing micro mortgages for entrepreneurial low-income families. The project was a finalist in the South by Southwest Eco Place by Design competition and won Student Grand Prize Award by the Congress for New Urbanism for Best Urban Design. Ubuntu's approach won the Resolution Project Social Venture Challenge 2015 at One Young World's Global Youth Leadership Summit, and to the World Merit Platform, the concept was presented at the United Nations headquarters in New York. In 2017, the American Institute of Architecture students recognized Wandile as one of their 60 legacy architects as part of their 60th anniversary celebration of student excellence in leadership, service, and design. Wandile was selected as one of 200 rising leaders from across Africa to the second cohort of Obama Leaders Africa program. Since then, his work has been featured in several media outlets, including Forbes and the Red Bull Social Entrepreneur Innovation feature. When Wandile isn't working on Ubuntu, he's an international speaker on ethical leadership and design, both in person and online at various corporate business and architecture schools. Please join me in welcoming Wandile Mthiyane.
Thank you very much for a very generous introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. Let's see. Share. 1 second. I'm going to start with a small video. Let me know if you guys can hear the sound.
No, Wandile, we cannot hear the sound.
You can't? Okay. Sorry, 1 second. Let me just fix that. Child. I want to give the next generation of kids the experience of home that I never had.
Ubuntu Design Group changes the ways we look at informal settlements. co-designing communities, and putting the people as the lead architect of their community and homes.
We believe that no one knows best where they're going to live than the person who's actually going to live there.
I never really had a place to call home. In a selfish way, I'm doing what I'm doing to find out what home is. Apartheid architecture pushed a certain group of people.
They've put up and pulled down RDP houses 4 times.
Into sort of the worst conditions.
These contractors that aren't really building proper houses. I mean, houses don't even last 5 years.
In government setting, there's a lot of people with money who come and throw money to the problem.
A lot of money is being wasted currently.
You've got to start seeing it as being something which builds from the bottom, because that is socially sustainable.
Why am I doing this?
I'd like to start off by a quote from one of the greats. I.M. Pei says, "Architecture is the very mirror of life. You only have to cast your eyes on buildings to feel the presence of the past, the spirit of the place. They are a reflection of society." My name is Wandile Mthiyane. I'm the founder and CEO of Ubuntu Design Group. I am from Durban, South Africa, and I'm really excited to be here. I'm in Canada, but whilst in South Africa. It's very weird, but exciting at the same time. You know, we can't speak about the role of architecture in social justice without talking about leadership, right? Because we need to be leaders in order for us to bring about the change that we want to see. The problem, though, is that every time we think about leadership or we talk about leadership, it's always this icon thing that is reserved for a few minorities. You think of Nelson Mandela ending apartheid, you think of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, and we forget that Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King didn't just wake up leaders who ended apartheid and led the civil rights movement, but it was a series of small steps that's led to this great change that ended up changing the future of the world as we see it today. So I'd like to challenge you on your perception of what leadership is. This past November, I had the privilege of meeting President Barack Obama and the First Lady, Michelle. I promise I am on this picture. They just cut me out. And when we met President Obama, he said something very interesting, where he says that we are the leaders that we've been waiting for. We are the ones we've been waiting for. You know, when you're growing up as a kid, you always expect your parents to be the one to do something, right? When you're in school, it's your teachers, it's your professors. In the world, it's the government. There's always someone else who has a responsibility to, quote unquote, bring about change. But in reality, those people aren't changing things, right? But in reality, it is us that needs to bring about change. So I always struggled with this idea of leadership and just also passion and what I'm here for. And I think, you know, President Obama's words really echoed in with me when he said, you know, during his presidency, he always had these summer interns who would come over to the White House from all these Ivy League schools and top schools and very type A type of folks. So at the end of the series, what would happen is inevitably he would have this Q&A session with all of them before they leave, and they would ask different questions. And at the end of the series, inevitably one of them would raise up their hand and say, "How do I become president?" And then he chuckles and says, you know, when I was 25 in Colombia, I wasn't thinking about how do I become president. I was probably chasing girls and learning about Nelson Mandela and the work of Mahatma Gandhi. And as a result of studying these folks and having young South Africans come over to Colombia and speak about their struggle against apartheid, who were part of the African National Congress, this inspired in him. It made him realize that he also had a responsibility to society to make it better. And as a result, he started community organizing and left Colombia to go to the South Side Chicago and work with communities there. And he says, you can't change a country without being able to change a state. You can't change a state without being able to change a city, and you can't change a city without being able to change a neighborhood. And I would add, you can't change a neighborhood without being able to first change yourself. And I preface my conversation in this because I understand there's a lot of young architecture students who are part of this, who are thinking to themselves, like, what's my role in all of this? How can I participate? Or who feel like they don't have the right skill sets or tools to participate. But to you, I say, you are the leaders that we've been waiting for. You are the change that you want to seek. So I grew up in post-apartheid South Africa. I was born around the border when apartheid was ending. And growing up in Durban, South Africa, like any other children, I loved to play house. But growing up in a shanty town, our houses were too small to play house in. So what we did was we learned from our parents, who, whenever a new neighbor came in, they would build houses for them. So we built our own playhouses. You see, in my community, there was no architect because everyone was an architect. Everyone built their own houses. So we'd build these houses right next to our family's shack, and they would fall on us, and then we'll try again, and then one will run and steal rice from their home and other beans, and we would cook and spices. Even though these were not, the most fire-safe things to do at the time, the food did show taste good. And when we would build these homes, that to me were the passion and the resourcefulness that I learned, which led to who I am today. We had to learn how to use what we had to create spaces and places to play in, spaces and places to live in, as we were learning from our parents. Even though we didn't have the most fancy toys and all the other things that kids get to play with, we got to make our own experiences. And I think that's what architecture at its fundamental core really is all about, being able to create spaces that are contextual to people's experiences and lives. But as I was growing up in South Africa, I wanted to study architecture as a result of what I saw in my community. So basically, the architecture in my community was shaped by apartheid, right? So it was very segregated. Black people had to live in these very congested areas, whilst white South Africans lived in the cities, and they were in a thriving economy. So I wanted to study architecture so that I could combine my community's ingenuity and creativity and take all of that and combine it with learning about structural safety. Because even though it was exciting to be in these communities, every time it rained, we were always concerned that the house will fall on us. Every time there was a fire, we were concerned that it could burn the whole place down. So that's what led me to study architecture. And then I went to study architecture at Andrews University in Michigan. And as I was studying architecture, I quickly realized that there's this perception that architecture is a commodity for the rich, right? I remember I was excited when I saw the curriculum on the syllabi saying that, the first chapter of history of architecture in second year was going to tackle, African architecture. So I remember going to class excited, and we started learning about Imhotep and the pyramids of Saqqara, and how that ended up shaping the foundation of what we now see as Western architecture, from the Greco-Romans, the columns, the colonnades, the orders, and how all of this really shaped it. But within 2 weeks, we had jumped onto the next topic and then went on to study the rest of the 500-page book on Western architecture. And that's left a scar on me because it told me two things. Number one, the only thing that matters about architecture in Africa is what happened in Egypt. And I wasn't from Egypt. So it told me that contributions from my community didn't matter, or rather architecture wasn't for people like me. And that's really disconnected me from the architectural experience now, because I kept going to class to study something that I didn't see myself or my community in, right? So when we learned about the Colosseum or the latest Frank Gehry building, I just couldn't imagine anyone in my community living in that building, but let alone even just being able to see that building, right, in real life. So I started challenging the status quo and, fighting back on professors. And I started Ubuntu Design Group based on the fundamental premise that, architecture ought to serve everyone, not just the 1%. What about the other 99% of the world, right? So if architecture was so effective in apartheid and segregating and oppressing, then community-led design can enable opportunities and bring people together. And something that was close to my heart was designing and building affordable housing in South Africa. So a lot of people that I found when I was in the West was this thinking that people who are quote unquote poor or from low income communities are lazy. They need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, even though if they're poor, then they probably don't have those boots. And that's why they're poor, right? And that's the furthest from the truth. The truth is people living in low income communities or informal settlements, such as the one you see, are some of the most creative individuals in the world. They can make a building out of anything, right? And I had grown up to see that. And I remember I was sitting in a college class, and when I was sitting there, we were talking about how do we mix low income and high income families into one neighborhood, right? To create this urban fabric of a holistic neighborhood and avoid gentrification. And a student from Singapore raised up their hand and said, I don't want to live next to a bomb. And as you can imagine, I felt targeted because I came from these communities. So that sparked a very heated debate. But that just goes to show sort of the narrative that currently exists. When you strip people away from their dignity and then you don't see them as people, you start seeing them as objects, you start seeing them as bombs, and you start having all of these labels, right? So when we started Ubuntu Design Group, we wanted to change this, to design architecture and affordable housing that restored people's dignity, right? Because we can't give dignity because people already have dignity. So we started studying how other affordable housing projects have gone, and we realized that over 90% of affordable housing projects have failed. And they failed because of three reasons. Number one, they are often built without consulting the people who are actually going to live there, which is very ironic because a huge part of architecture is consultative and getting to know what the client wants. But for some reason, when we're dealing with low-income communities, that doesn't matter. Number two, these homes were often built away from economic opportunities, away from cities, which is weird because the only reason why you have slums and shanty towns is because people are trying to move closer and to work and economic opportunities. And then number three, these were built as boxes, right? These boxes which were almost impossible to add on to, right? Which then forced the community to stay within that low income bracket. So basically you're designing for people to stay poor or to stay within that low income bracket. In South Africa, some of these communities didn't even have parking or roads. So you're saying you're disenfranchising people from having cars and all these different things. So those were the three things. So we were like, okay, we want to do a house that has the opposite of that. But in addition to that, when we looked at South Africa, there was something called apartheid architecture. So apartheid architecture is one of the most genius architectures ever existed. Because what they did was, this is a minority, which is less than 10% of the country ruling a majority, which is the other 90% of native Black South Africans. So what they did to control or divide and conquer, they designed these homes which were 40 square meters. They put them 40 kilometers away from the city centers, which then forced Black families within communities to spend 40% of their income commuting to work, right? And what that does, it makes them not to be able to develop their own communities. And these communities were called townships. They were devoid of economic opportunities, and they were devoid of social gatherings because that would have political implications. So here's the funny thing about all of this, is that 26 years post-apartheid, 26 years since Nelson Mandela became president, the communities didn't suddenly move closer to economic opportunities or closer to town. So people are still spending 40% of their income commuting to work, right? So this goes to show that the people who designed these buildings back in the 1940s, 1950s, similar to the same thing that happened with affordable housing in America, or ghettos or the projects. This goes to show that the gravity of the lines you draw with your pencils have lasting impact in communities, especially communities of color. So in order for us to dismantle this, how can we do this? Number one, with Ubuntu Architecture Summer Abroad, what we do is we take college students from around the world and make them work with a community that's affected by apartheid architecture. And the first step is listening to build. We work with the community where we let the community be the lead architects of designing and shaping the future of their own homes and communities. Far too long, we've been designing for low-income communities, but it's time for low-income communities to take the lead in designing of their own homes. This is us in Ubuntu working with the different community there. So we moved from this home to this. So each home we build with Ubuntu Design Group, this is a handicapped home, accessible home we built for the Mthiyane family. The Mthiyane family is a family that had lost their home due to a light rainstorm, both living with disabilities. Mrs. Mthiyane had worked at a daycare for 10 years. So we built this home and we had a commercial component to it, which in this case is a daycare. And the family is now living in a dignified home. We built the daycare for 6 kids. They now are running a daycare with 18 kids. They're using the profits from that daycare to build a whole new facility. So now 18 mothers can now go to work as they send their kids to school. So you start seeing the ripple effect of designing for the place and for this community. So it's not about the house, it's not about the commercial space, but it's about the house and the commercial space and the church and the street. That's what makes a holistic neighborhood and a thriving neighborhood. And it's these small changes that start shaping and changing the way our communities look. How do we plug into the local economy rather than bringing large conglomerates, malls into these places and taking the money to Holland versus staying in Ubuntu in South Africa? So this is the community of Ubuntu. This is what it looks like. After working with them, we designed this urban scheme master plan with students from Andrews University and around the world. And I think what was really interesting is that when you look at this, it doesn't look like something you would see in Detroit. It doesn't look like something you would see in Rome, but it looks like something that is contextual that you would see within Zulu architecture in KwaZulu-Natal, in Umbumbulu. This is the Mthiyane family as they moved in to their new home, as you can see by the smiles on their faces. And this is what the home looks like when it was finished. So each family would have a different use case for that commercial space. They could have it as an Airbnb, they could run a convenience store, because at the end of the day, housing doesn't take people out of poverty, but economic opportunities enables the families to thrive. So these are some of the students we worked with as we work with the community in designing and building these homes. So what we do is we host these programs where students can apply to be a part of this Ubuntu Architecture Summer Abroad, and with individual schools, they can either take it as an independent study or an elective, or just take it independently so that they can start shaping communities in a contextual, sustainable way. And I think that's what architecture really is all about. It's not just about us teaching these communities, but it's about us creating a new generation of architects, right? That understands the implications of the lines that they draw, that know architecture beyond just the Western framework, that are willing to understand others and start designing spaces that are more equitable, more inclusive, that enable opportunities for others. Thank you very much.
Wandile, thank you for that very delightful presentation. It's going to be such a pleasure to discuss some of these issues as well as we get into the panel. So now it's my pleasure to begin the panel portion of this event. And we've had the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Craig Wilkins and Wandile Mthiyane. But now I'd like to introduce our remaining 2 panelists. So first we have Martina Jileckova, a CEO of Horizon Housing. Martina is passionate about Horizon's mission of providing affordable homes to those in need and building welcoming, inclusive communities. Martina came to the role in 2017 with 20 years of experience in the real estate sector and a strong track record of driving meaningful growth, solid operations, and stakeholder focus. With an ambitious strategic plan, Horizon offered the perfect marriage of her experience in real estate and her passion for implementing innovative solutions. As a respected leader within the sector, Martina is committed to building strong partnerships with government, private sector, and community groups. She currently serves as the co-chair of the Community Housing Affordability Collective, provides leadership as chair for the Opening Doors Conference, and is a member of the Calgary Local Immigration Partnership Council and the Aboriginal Standing Committee on Housing and Homelessness. She serves on boards for the Community Housing Transformation Center and Alberta Network of Public Housing Agencies. Martina also served on the City of Calgary Subdivision and Development Appeal Board for more than a decade and holds a Master of Environmental Design from the University of Calgary and a Certificate of Advanced Real Estate Development Economics from Simon Fraser University. We also have here joining us Vivian Ton. Vivian is a graduate student in the Master of Architecture program at the University of Calgary School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape. She recently graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Urban Studies. Over the summer of 2020, Vivian co-founded Advocates for Equitable Design Education, AEDE, a student group dedicated to the advancement of critical pedagogy in design and the recovery of dialogue minimized in current design practices. So these four members will be making up our panel today on equity in design and design education. So why don't we get started? So often in discourse at the intersection of activism, equity, and the built environment, options to act are framed within a binary. Perhaps a false binary, but a binary nonetheless. The options being either work with the system to find ways to serve those in need, as some of the necessary support structures might already be in place, or work outside and perhaps even against the system to serve those in need, since it's sometimes argued, how can a system that created this inequity also serve to address it? So Martina, as CEO of Horizon Housing, you lead a not-for-profit organization that provides affordable, integrated, and supportive homes for vulnerable Calgarians, particularly those with mental health and mobility challenges, the working poor, and those living addiction, homelessness, and domestic violence. Across your 20 years of experience in the real estate sector, what have been your greatest challenges in providing those much needed services vis-a-vis existing frameworks and systems that perhaps aren't immediately conducive to such support? And Craig and Wandile, after Martina's answer, perhaps you could also respond with some additional insight in how you yourselves have navigated these challenges in your communities in the US and South Africa, respectively.
Well, thanks very much, Alberto, and thank you everyone for joining today, and thank you, John, for the introduction and doing the land acknowledgement on the behalf of all of us here in Calgary. And so, you know, Alberto, like you really asked a thought-provoking question that's already pushing the boundary, in the sense that now we are, you know, thinking about do we do something revolutionary, work outside of the system, or do we take more of a pragmatic or incremental approach and work within the system? And you know, obviously the role that I've taken is I am solidly working within the system, and I think it's a really thought-provoking question that we won't be really able to give justice to, but let me just tell you then a little bit about our you know, what we do here in Calgary and Alberta and Canada, and what the biggest challenges are. So, and I also want you to know that I don't shy away from revolutions. In 1989, I was part of the student-led revolution back in former Czechoslovakia, where we decided to overthrow the communist regime. But I think here in Canada, I think we have lots of opportunities to be meaningful part of the solution without, you know, resulting to revolutions. And so, that doesn't mean though working within the system, and I'm picking up on the themes that Craig and Wandile mentioned in their presentations, it doesn't mean that working within the system we don't push the boundary and always challenge the status quo, right? And so for us, the system, the housing system, is really about housing people. So we need access to capital to build homes, affordable homes, and we partner with architects and builders to do that. But the other piece of the system is that because we're affordable housing provider, what we bump up against is the income side of the equation. A lot of the people that we house simply do not have the incomes that are needed to be able to buy a house in Calgary or rent a house in Calgary. And I'll just give you a couple examples. An average one bedroom here in Calgary, but the same numbers apply across the country in Canada, same for the US. Average one bedroom in Calgary is, call it $1,000 a month for rent. And in Calgary, if you are not working and live on what we can call informally welfare, you get, call it $700 from the government. So you don't have enough money to afford rent. If in Alberta you have a disability, you get about $1,600 a month. If you have to pay $1,000 of that towards rent, you are left with $600 a month to live on, and that does not leave you with much room to really pay for necessities of life, such as food, your kids' education, and all that good stuff, right? And so that's when we are talking about challenges, Alberto, we really look at both the access to capital to build housing, but also ultimately address the inequalities that come from, frankly, the lack of income. And so what's our biggest challenge? It's really, these are all policy decisions, right? So what we need to do is we really need to challenge the status quo and push the boundary and always ask why, right? So working within the system means really making sure that we ask the questions, why is our income support set at such a low level that I cannot go and afford to live in my community? The other part of the equation is we have to give good reasons for why we want that change. And so we've been working really hard with our neighbors and our communities and our politicians to make the case for why we need to ensure that the residents who live with us have the adequate supports. And so it's really about changing the hearts and minds of our neighbors, our communities, and the politicians who put the policies in place that ultimately shape the world that we live in. And so working within the system for me has been, a mixture of being tenacious and keeping an eye on the goal, which in Calgary, we want to end homelessness and we want to make sure that everybody has an affordable housing place to live. And also it's the tenacity, but also pushing the boundary, pushing the status quo. And what's really neat, one thing I want to leave with you, because I think my 5 minutes is up, and again, picking up on the theme that Wandile mentioned, he talked about mentorship and how important it is for people. I really believe that a lot of the solutions here in Calgary, in Alberta, in Canada, and in the States come from ultimately the civil society. So it's us in the not-for-profit sector. You can call it profit for purpose or social enterprise. It's us who are working on, solving those complex challenges. It's the intersection of the built world, the architecture, but we are adding the architecture and the real estate, and we are layering it on top of complex social issues to solve. And I just think that it's a wonderful sector to work in. And so I am kind of doing, the 3 point before Wandile's point. We need more leaders that join our sector, and we need more leaders that basically say, I not only want to build excellent architecture, I need to build architecture that is responsive to our community needs. And I can tell you, speaking from experience, my work in the sector has been incredibly rewarding. So we have challenges, but I'm calling on the next generation of leaders to join us and solve them. It's an exciting place to be.
Thank you, Martina. Craig?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer this because I don't, I used to very much engage that binary. It's one of the reasons why, you know, I refused to join one of the architectural professional organizations. It's one of the reasons why I was not initially thinking about a career in academia. I tend to be contrarian by nature, so submitting myself to a framework that required you to. I mean, you're not going to. Well, it's difficult. I've come to realize that they are not mutually exclusive. That advocacy needs to happen within and without. And I've tried to position myself in that space with one foot sort of in the institutional structure, and because it, in a sense, it gives me a sense to not only critique the structure itself, but find ways that you can enter and sort of, weak points or flex points that you can begin to become more foundational in the work, and it spreads. But also, the foot that's outside keeps, at least for me, it keeps me grounded. It keeps me grounded in a way that I don't become very or totally academically or institutionally focused, because there are experts who don't exist within this sort of recognized institutional realm. There are people who have a great deal of knowledge, and who don't particularly either are not invited or aren't interested in sort of the ways in which institutions and bureaucracies work. And so I find engaging that kind of thinking is incredibly important and enriching, and in some ways much more educational than what typically passes as formal education. So, I think maybe in demonstrating the bus stop project, which we actually ended up calling door stops, is an indication of that. We got institutional funding for it. The university gave us some money. The National the National Endowment of the Arts gave us some money. It was a competitive grant, so it wasn't, they just didn't give it to us. We had to prove that it was worthwhile. But we got that money so that we could work the way we wanted to work. We got that money so that we could engage directly with it. We paid artists directly. We paid community members to come to meetings directly. We paid for their knowledge. We paid for their skills, and we embraced their skills. I mean, this project really wouldn't have happened had they not chosen to participate. So, and again, if even going back to the larger project in Minneapolis, that effort didn't start from an institutional standpoint. I mean, the municipality actually put those people there, right? The university was not incredibly engaged in that area at all. It took, the power of the people who were being disenfranchised to bring their agency forward, to believe in their agency and believe in that they could literally, speak truth to power and make power change. So, I mean, I don't know how you can ignore that kind of that kind of agency in the public realm. And I you know, I think, you know, the profession can learn a lot from that. It's just one of the reasons I teach the studio and the seminar courses that I teach. I try to get people to believe in their agency, to change, to actually act as change agents, to question the infrastructures in which they are expected to accept without criticism. Things are the way they are, not because they're natural. They're the way they are because somebody decided this is the way they're going to be. And if someone decides this is the way they're going to be, someone else can decide this is not the way it's going to be. So it is not, we are not without our own power and agency to make things differently. And so I believe in that. But I also believe that, you know, there isn't necessarily this binary to that belief. It doesn't matter whether you're inside or outside. What matters is your belief in the power of change and your belief in the power of your own agency to make that happen.
Thank you, Craig. Wandile, what has your experience been in South Africa?
Thank you, man. I'm just gonna be honest and say, you know, I am a tired and angry young man at how successful our parents have been in failing us, you know, to what we're inheriting and all these problems that we're seeing today. So I obviously leaned a lot more towards, you know, burn the system. Let's start over. Let's do something independent of the government or the current structures as they be, etc. Until recently, actually, I was talking to one of President Obama's senior advisors, and I was asking the same questions, like, how did you guys at like 25, 26 decide to go into politics when it's so corrupt, you know, just like it's a mess in all these different ways? Like, why would you choose that? And they laughed, but they also flipped the script on me and they said, well, if there's all these problems that you see within public office, then why don't you go and fix it, right? Like this idea that you're the one. So that's really has really changed my perception on maybe how to tackle some of these things, where, you know, the truth is, you know, public office holds a lot of power. It's the decisions these guys make influence architecture, influence, you know, all key areas of our human lives. And as a result, we're out here talking about a president who did this decision, which led to this segregation and this and that. So that just goes to show the power within systems. So I think it's important for us to go in and change those systems from within as well, and take up the leadership ourselves, as well as, you know, some need to stay outside and keep screaming at the system and changing things from outside and leading in a slightly different direction.
Thank you, Wandile. So to, you know, following up on those perspectives and on hearing about both the challenges and opportunities to bring systemic change to communities in which we work and live, in the context of education, how can we reframe or readapt existing pipelines to collectively move towards a more ecologically and socially conscious generation of architects, landscape architects, urbanists, and designers? So Vivian, as a current architecture student yourself and as president and co-founder of the University of Calgary student group Advocates for Equitable Design Education, you have been engaging in conversations with other design students across Canada in matters related to equity in design and design education. So responding to Martina, Craig, and Wandile, could you share with us what you perceive the current educational climate in Canada to be, and what students believe the role of their design education can be? And you know, following up on that, additionally, Craig, Wandile, and Martina, from your combined perspectives that cross academia and practice, could you also share with us how design education should be responding and acting to these issues of equity in the built environment?
Sure. Thanks, Craig and Wandile, for your presentations today, and Martina as well, and for the invitation to participate here. So speaking as a student, I think what's been constantly framed and reinforced is sort of the post-secondary institution as an insular entity, or as it's been framed mockingly, like a safe space for theoretical exploration. There's always this sort of sense of cognitive dissonance between what we perceive to be school and not school, or what's just after graduation, really, when we start to pursue work in the industry or in the real world, so to speak. And I'm bringing this up because in design schools, this sort of bifurcation of theory and praxis can be quite pronounced. We treat one realm as elastic and the other as being constrained by rules and regulations, as a world where things are already a given. And I think it's both critical to have our education be this sort of safe space for exploration that teases out new understandings and new ideas. But I guess the issue I'm trying to get at is, who is the safe space made for? And when we consider the history of our institutions, the common thread has been that they've been safe spaces for the ideas and ideals of cisgendered, straight, able-bodied white men. And now, as our spaces have started to become more diverse and progressive, we need to look at how these spaces are beginning to evolve. So what sort of conversations and discussions are being had or are being deemed appropriate to have even in these spaces? Are we being as inclusive and as rigorous in our methods as we need to be? Are these spaces actually more inclusive, or are they just diverse in a sort of optical way? Are they critical? Do students have access to and knowledge of the resources that they can find to develop a vocabulary to describe their lived experiences and to understand complex social issues, even when their studies don't specifically examine those things? And I don't know, if educational spaces are one entity treated distinct from real life, then the other thing to consider is, how do we continue to limit ourselves and our understanding by this reinforcement of this duality? When we do this, whose lived experiences and stories are neglected? This is really, it's not a new interpretation or understanding, but I believe that for a whole new generation, the events this last June with the civil rights protests in the United States and then across the world, compounded with the wide-ranging impacts of the global pandemic, and an increased reliance on digital technologies to connect and relate with one another, there's been this huge collective realization that a lot of the problems, the legacies, and histories that create the world have been subsumed and been buried by this heteropatriarchal capitalist machine. And these issues are unearthing themselves in more pronounced ways. Reconciling with the fact that our education has not prepared us so thoroughly as it should is profound. And sort of that trauma of seeing those cracks is, I think, what has mobilized a lot of young people again to create their own support systems. But that being said, I also don't want to diminish the labor of activists, educators, policymakers, and others who've contributed to this body of scholarship and action, as this work has been in progress for a really long time. I'm basically part of Gen Z, so I'm just also beginning to discover this work as well. I know there's clear attempts at the institutional level to mobilize towards change and equity, to acknowledge this rift, but also to recognize the complicity of our educational pipelines in producing such conditions of inequality. In response to the latter question, I believe that students recognize the value of the specialized design training as a means to synthesize complex bodies of knowledge, to critically examine our built and natural environments, and to understand how design may produce conditions that significantly impact the lives of people. there's still this optimistic outlook that envisions design as a way to advocate for possibilities through a dissection of our current modalities of living. But with that said, students are also consciously asking for more out of their design education. It's not enough to just learn about design, but to understand its agency and its complicities, to know how it affects lives. And it's imperative that our education prepares us for really what comes next, and especially for the nature of this work to be situated in political economy as well. And I think to really pursue equitable design, I think there's a responsibility to teach students about the precarity of the design work, especially given the huge investment it takes to pay tuition, not only for an undergraduate degree, but to pursue a master's, and to teach students about our rights and our dignity as future workers as well, and to demand equitable treatment, especially for students from marginalized and disenfranchised communities. So the role of design education could be one that empowers and recognizes the intersectional lived experiences of BIPOC, of members of the LGBTQIA2 Spirit Plus communities, and of persons with disabilities, and is really active in inscribing the daily realities of our pluralistic world in the basic ethos of our pedagogy.
Vivian, thank you for a response wise beyond your years. I'm so glad that you were able to join us for this panel and lend a younger student perspective to the seasoned voices that we have here as well. Martina, as a alumni of our program, and also, adding to the Canadian perspective, could you respond to this question?
Thank you, Alberto, and yes, and I'll be brief, picking up again on the themes that we've already talked about. All of the panelists have touched upon is really ultimately it's about, and I'll put it in sort of simple terms. It's simple terms for me. It's that listening to the end user, right? So we need to really understand who we are building the housing for and what their needs are and the need of the surrounding community. So when I started my degree, I was in the planning stream of things. When I graduated, I had a good handle on a lot of the technical side of things, land use and all the good stuff. We had a great philosopher who, we got to discuss things about what's right and what's wrong. And then when I went into the real world, I was really interested in the real estate form, the built form. And what I didn't really fully appreciate, didn't connect to until I met the people that we house. So it wasn't until I met Bonnie, who was abused for many, many years and has lifelong physical implications of that. John, Annie. Until I met those folks who now live with us, I didn't really fully understand and appreciate what we need in that built environment that really truly meets their needs. So for me, and I know that the School of Architectural Landscape, Planning and Landscape is doing that, but to me it's that connection to the ultimate cause, the ultimate need in the community. So while you are going through the education, if you're interested in the built form, if you're interested in the built form of affordable housing, come and visit in your communities, the affordable housing providers, and more importantly, meet the people who will live in the housing that we all design, so that you really truly get to know and understand who we are doing this all for together with.
Thank you, Martina. So following up on that, Craig, as one of your many levels as an academic, what has your experience been in trying to also act within these larger, sometimes ossified systems?
Frustrating, in a word. It's frustrating. I mean, on the one hand, bureaucracy and rules, regulations, requirements for accreditation are, in a sense, argued that we will perhaps generate a base level of education for everyone who wants to be in this profession. And I believe that's actually true. However, what the conversation has not necessarily been about, although I'm not quite sure how it's, I mean, you know, I don't feel at all comfortable commenting on the system in Canada. Here in the US, sort of all the regulatory bodies that deal with architecture, whether it be NCARB, which is National Council of Architectural Registration Boards, or NAB, the National Architectural Accreditation Board, all these things are not really, they don't move quickly. They aren't designed to respond. They aren't nimble organizations. And there are pros and cons to that. So when you have societal issues, when you have revelations about the cultural moment or the cultural decade that you are in, as a student, you expect those things to be engaged in your education. But it's a lot harder for bureaucracies to move with the speed of culture. It's just hard. And so, you know, over the last decade or so, I have watched students who have come into education, architectural education, both, you know, at the grammar school, high school, and college level, and the graduate level. And I also teach in a PhD program. And they're not really patient. And I don't know if that is a generational thing or a cultural thing or what. And so they are demanding change. They are demanding that, you know, curriculums move and adjust and embrace, you know, the current times and the conversations around inequity and justice and racial and spatial segregation. They are demanding that, because that is the world that they live in daily. So it's frustrating. It's frustrating for students. It's frustrating for faculty who perhaps maybe want to embrace this. It's very frustrating for faculty for whom these things are, quote unquote, considered not architecture, or architecture, or somewhat architecturally related or tangential, and they're not really foundational or fundamental. It's very, very frustrating and if not scary for faculty who are not well versed in these kinds of concerns. So there's a lot of head bumping going on in academia right now. But it's no different than what's going on outside, you know, in quote unquote the real world, and in some ways in the profession as well. So it's frustrating. I mean, that's sort of the bottom line, is that it's frustrating. So my sense of how we get around this, or how we get through this, or how we tend to harness this in a way that brings us together and doesn't sort of blow apart our sort of educational foundations, is that there needs to be really uncomfortable conversations that happen amongst these parties. And, you know, I'm not necessarily here to blow the horn of my institution. We have our own issues and concerns as well. We're certainly not perfect, if you ask our students, but at least they have taken the reins in a way that I have not seen happen since perhaps maybe the Columbia students who took over Avery Hall, the students who formed the Architects Resistance, the students at Yale who formed the Black Workshop, who just simply had enough. And they were going to push for institutional change, whether the institutions wanted to change or not. And I believe we are, we're very close to that kind of moment now. And the question becomes is how do institutions respond to that? I mean, that's one of the reasons I showed the organization Dark Matter University. They're literally creating the content that addresses the current conditions right now, because they are not required to fit their content within accreditation nodes, within NAB, within NCARB, within all these other sorts of things that are incredibly slow to change, but they also hold incredible power over not only your education, but your ability to get a license and practice. So these are the institutions. They're not so much the universities, although I think the universities are somewhat complicit in this. But I think if those entities, at least here in the US, if those entities are pushed to make their regulations a little more malleable, to understand that education happens in a number of different ways. It doesn't always have to happen at a university or in a classroom. It's not a box that's ticked off. It's actually a base of knowledge that gets applied, and you can demonstrate how you understand that knowledge in a number of different ways. Then I think universities or programs can be a lot more malleable. They can move more quickly to sort of embrace or at least situate these concerns within the curriculum, whether it's in a class or across classes, or right now it's very difficult for them to navigate that. And unless they have a reason to do so, i.e. students demanding and pushing for these changes, they're not going to do them. Or they're going to do them in a manner that by the time they get institutionalized, there's something else on the horizon. So no one's interested in that anymore. So it's frustrating, but if the field wants to remain relevant, if it wants to continue to bring in new blood, it's going to have to respond to those desires. People are not going to come and go through a program that is not going to address their concerns. They will find another way to address those concerns. So if we want our profession to flourish, we have to figure out a way to make that happen. Otherwise, we're going to go the way of the dodo bird. Very few people will be in a program. You might not find yourself in an institution anymore because, why would we pay for, they're eliminating, the humanities left and right. So why would they hesitate to eliminate architectural programs? States are actually questioning now, why do architects need a license? Why do they get a monopoly to practice? What are they doing? It looks like they're doing more harm than good. But why are we giving them this monopoly? So we have to prove our value. We have to show our value to people, right? And so I wrote this piece. I wrote it for the Biennale, but it's been postponed. And it was basically saying, the age of the gentleman architect is over. The age of the activist architect has begun. We have to be proactive. We have to prove our worth. We have to engage communities which the gentleman architect would disdain. because those are the places where the problems lie. And those are the places where our skills are most desperately needed. And if we don't teach our students that, or we don't help them embrace that, or we actively fight that, we won't have students. So.
Craig, thank you. And actually, I think that idea of the activist architect is a perfect segue to Wandile. You know, you shared with us an anecdote from early on in your education, and now you're also working in that space through your study abroad program that you've created for the Ubuntu Design Group. So could you share with us your thoughts as well on this matter, following up on the comments from Vivian, Martina, and Craig?
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. I just want to say shout out to Vivian. That was a really good point to saying, like, who is the architecture curriculum built for, right? Like, who was it built for? And it hasn't changed. We've just been put into a curriculum built for someone else. Like, you're wearing someone else's pants and they don't fit you, but this is what you need to go through in order for you to be X. And that's why we're struggling with identity within architecture, because we are practicing architecture that wasn't meant for us. In fact, in most cases, was meant to oppress some of us. I think I would start off by saying, I think Churchill puts it best when he says, we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape who we are, right? We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape who we are. So I'd add, we shape our architectural education, thereafter it shapes who we are, right? So how have we shaped the architectural education, and what is it shaping? So, you know, from redlining to apartheid architecture to ghettos to projects, clearly it's not shaping good products till today, right? So there's clearly a need for a revolution. There's a need for change. And maybe just to highlight, so in light of Black Lives Matter and the protests and everything that's been going on, everyone is talking about, you know, oh, defund the police, right? Oh, the police are this, and this is what's wrong. But no one is talking about what's the role of architecture in all of this, like what's the role of design. But let me help break that down a little bit for you. So, you know, when you, for example, in the United States, when you're looking at the 1950s with redlining and the creation of Levittown, and, you know, incentivizing white families to have homes. And at that time, that home in Levittown would be like $7,000. And then Black families not being able to get those loans, but paying more to rent a crappy building than the guys who are owning a nice building. And then a couple generations later, those houses cost $300,000 and more today. So, you know, what that means is that white families have been able to accumulate over $200,000 to $300,000 worth of wealth, whilst Black families haven't been able to do that, right? So, which then leads to, you know, white families being able to send their kids to college and pay for that, and, you know, and this income and wealth disparity that's ever growing, right? So now you have a community designed and devoid of economic opportunities, devoid of educational opportunities, and how the taxes work is that, you know, your education is pretty much non-existent if it's a poor community, because no one is paying for the textbooks, which is very strange for me coming from Africa. I thought things would be better, but that's another topic. Anyway, so I get there, no textbook, poor educational system, which leads to higher dropout rates. Higher dropout rate has a direct scientific correlation to higher unemployment. Higher unemployment and scarcity has a higher correlation to higher crime rates. Higher crime rate enables governments to what? To put in more police, incentivizes government to put in more police. And more police in communities of color leads to police brutality. Police brutality leads to us protesting today. But someone had to design that. Someone designed those segregated communities. Someone was complicit in making them happen. And that begins with us as designers, as architects, right? So I think we need to not absolve ourselves of our role in creating racial inequities and in design justice or injustice that we've created. So I think architectural education needs to not cherry pick the role of architecture in the world, but they need to be able to spotlight and highlight what architecture has done, which has led to the demise of society as is. And that's why I started Ubuntu Architecture Summer Abroad, so that I could take students from America, from Canada, from different parts, devoid them from that emotional attachment and politics and all the stuff they read on Facebook about their communities, and put them in a different context and realize what apartheid architecture did in South Africa, but what those lasting impacts are still having today in that particular context. But then again, it's not enough to complain, but I also want them to be part of the solution. I want them to be the change that they want to see. So they also then get to start working with the community and understanding through listening to build, to design and build a new community or a dignified home and dignified communities where they learn about design justice, so they get the tools. Because to be honest, when you work with communities, the real architects of the community, you learn way more than you give, right? So the idea is that when they go back to Calgary or they go back to New York or they go back to Chicago, they now start using those same design principles to start seeing beyond just their framework of culture or their architectural understanding of their own community, but to be more inclusive, to be more equitable in how they design spaces and places. So in regards to colleges and universities, you know, I'm torn in between whether they are ill-equipped or just not ready for change. You know, I've had conversations with Columbia, Notre Dame, Andrews, and it's just like they've built this self-destructive system that's preventing them from being able to change, right? Like students are listening here, like how many of you guys within your educational system learn about the indigenous people who lived in Calgary before everyone was there, as architecture and how they built buildings, and how can you draw from that today? How much of your education is that? How much time have you spent learning about Chinese or African architecture or Zulu architecture, right? This goes back to IMPE. It says that architecture is a reflection of society. What are we reflecting and what are we educating? So I think universities really need to, I think, start figuring out how to adapt to the times, but also how to adapt to the people that they're serving, which has drastically become more diverse than when they were built, right? So I think there's a two-pronged way. One is for them to outsource some of these programs to other initiatives, such as the ones Craig mentions or the ones that we're running, to start being able to do this on their behalf or partner with them in that sense, as they start building capacity to be able to start educating architecture that's more inclusive and sustainable and reflects everyone. Thank you.
I just want to add something real quick to your list of schools that either are ill-equipped to do it, or what was the other thing that you said? Are not ready to do it. I would say that there are schools that are actively, intentionally not wanting to do it. That they are comfortable with where they are and their student body and who they serve and the issues in which they engage. And you know, I'm not. That's, you know, what's happening at Yale and the revolution at Michigan and other. We're not having that here. We're not having it.
Agreed. So, yeah, I've had to face a couple of those, including the school that I went to. But yes, agreed.
So following on those very thought-provoking perspectives, and in the interest of time, I have one last question for the panel, trying to bring together these thoughts on education and how we as architects are complicit in the built environment, even through the systems and organizations that we inhabit. So, I think if it were any other year, we might have concluded with a traditional synthesis and, let's be honest, a vague call to action for further examination down the line. But this is not any other year. This is the year a global pandemic has killed hundreds of thousands, and in the process, a health crisis has exacerbated and brought to bear a wide-ranging set of inequities that, make no mistake, have always been there. The only difference now is that a significantly larger percentage of the public and wider society has become aware of how urgent addressing these issues are. Black Lives Matter and climate change are two that come to mind. So both in the context of awareness, but also within the context of this period of transition, a double-edged silver lining, if you will, I want to engage in some projective and perhaps even radical thinking. Craig and Wandile, in your respective scholarship and work, you both center communities as designers, providing tools and frameworks for self-empowerment. Craig, you've described your work as urban acupunctures, small architectures that relieve the pressures of everyday life, often built with salvaged and repurposed materials in the city's neglected spaces, the aesthetics of making do. Wandile, you've talked about co-opting apartheid architecture to bring about change. In your words, if apartheid architecture could segregate and oppress, community-based design can liberate and enable opportunity, growth, and commerce. So in your perspectives, and in the context of a post-COVID planet, how must we recalibrate approaches to increasing equity in the built environment? What things have changed and what things have remained the same, and how we should approach forging cities for all, not just for the select few? And Martina and Vivian, as current Canadian residents, what additional methods, mediums, and matters should we be integrating to, like I said, forge these cities for all? And when I say cities for all, I especially mean for our Black and Brown brothers and sisters, for the Indigenous communities whose land we stole and pillaged, for the LGBTQIA community, for those that are differently abled, for those in poverty and experiencing economic hardship, for immigrants, for people of all cultures, creeds, and countries. So in short, for all people, regardless of their race and or ethnicity, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, disability status, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, military and various status, and any other characteristic protected and not yet protected by applicable law. So the four of you, if you could just please share with us, in as brief as you can condense your thoughts, maybe 2 minutes max, what are our paths forward for our cities? Craig, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, okay, I'll start off. I don't know. I don't have an answer. I don't. This just happened. It's going to continue to happen for a while. Honestly, I don't know that I have an answer. I think I have a sense that we're going to have to reevaluate what we consider valuable. And for the longest time, people have not been considered valuable. Certainly, BIPOC people have not been considered valuable, which is why the at least in our country, the virus has hit them so hard, and they are passing at 2 to 3 times the rate of any other folks here in the U.S. And it's because we simply haven't considered their living conditions, their environment as valuable. We haven't invested in them in those places as much as we've invested any place else. So I think, it's sort of laid bare, again, at least in our country, it's laid bare the inadequacies, not only of space, and I say this often, space is life. Space is where all your benefits come from. What school you go to, whether there are parks in your neighborhood, whether there are grocery stores in your neighborhood. Space is absolutely life. And if you don't have access to it, or if your access to it is unjust or unequal, or then your life is going to end up being that same way. So I think this moment has just blown any kind of hole in arguments that, the way in which people live, the way people act, the fact that they aren't being educated, or aren't taking advantage of our education opportunities. All that stuff has just been, those arguments are out the window. They're gone. So we're going to have to rethink how do we enact value across the board, not just for one group of people, not just for one side of town, but for everybody. What that looks like, I have absolutely no idea, but that is the key. That's the foundation, that you have to value people in order to help people. And that is what I think, I hope will come out of this this pandemic moment.
Martina, why don't you share with us your thoughts?
Thank you. So, you know, we're talking about change. We're talking about diversity, and that we won't. There's this real need to change the status quo, and we are juxtaposing those conversations, you know, against the context of the global pandemic. And so one thing that I've observed, and I'm going to again bring it to a very applied level, for us in the not-for-profit sector, so what do? We provide housing. And so when the news of the pandemic hit, we had to adapt really quickly. We had to make really fast decisions, good decisions, but gone was the inertia. Gone was the luxury of time, where we are able to say, okay, let's make a decision, but you know, we can take a week to make it. We had to act quickly. Why? Because we had over 1,200 residents who stay with us, and we need to keep them safe, whatever we thought was safe, you know, in March. And so for us, when we were reflecting upon some of the positives, is we had to make really quick decisions, and we had to do really quick action. And you know, it's kind of sometimes you get used to inertia. I mean, systems we are talking about are about inertia and not changing. But we kind of, if there's a silver lining to the pandemic, in my sector, we had to learn to adapt really quickly and make really fast decisions. And guess what? We got comfortable with that. And so then when, you know, Black Lives Matter protests happened, you know, we have the pandemic, and now we see all this conversation happening around the issues of inequality, including Indigenous communities in Canada, and that's a big consideration for us here in Canada. We were able to go and have a really quick conversation with our board saying, hold it, we gotta reset, like, and we have to make some decisions fast. So what I think, you know, in terms of methods, what I, you know, and again, you asked a wonderful, thought-provoking question, but when I'm reflecting, I think if there's a silver lining for me is in this pandemic is that we learn how to make decisions fast, and let's carry that forward. Let's take a look at an issue and let's make a quick decision to shake this inertia.
Wandile, could you follow up and go next in answering this last final question?
Yeah, you know, for me, actually, I think there is a solution, and I think it's in South Africa. There's this concept of Ubuntu, which means I am because you are, or I am because we are, right? And you know, for example, I went to high school in Zimbabwe, very a place that's not the safest environment for the LGBTQI community. So I learned a lot of very homophobic things and tendencies and stuff. So when I went to college, I had these thoughts, but beyond that, I had been taught that I am because we are. So I was able to see myself in others. So I was very curious. So it was by building a relationship with the LGBTQI plus community that I got to understand, you know, my friends better, and I got to love my friends for who they are, and that fundamentally changed how I viewed them and how I viewed myself. And I realized it's actually more in common than we have that divides us. And you know, right now when something happens, I'll be the first one to be in the streets to protest, or we're constantly having these conversations. I don't need a Black Lives Matter to happen for me to go and hold a plaque, right? it's a constant conversation and constant trying to create spaces and environments that are inviting and are suitable for everyone, because now I understand the struggles within their community the same way they understand the struggles within my community, right? So I say all of this to say, I've seen a lot of university deans come out with scripted apologies that we're going to do this and this, and it feels very uncomfortable for them, but also just like uncomfortable to even look at, because the idea is, I don't know what they want. I don't know what this community is. We're going to try this. We're going to try this. I'm like, no, it's not about they. It's about you. Are you able to see yourself in others? Like I am, because we are. So the time we start seeing dignity in others is the time we will start being able to value their voices. And when we start valuing their voices, we'll start designing curriculums that represents them. We'll start designing buildings that represent them. It starts by us seeing ourselves in others. It starts by love. It starts by dignity. It starts by value. If you still see, when you see people protest or this, that's, you think of the other, I think that's where the problem is.
Thank you, Wandile. And Vivian, why don't you close us out? And again, brief, like condensing your thoughts, 2 minutes, go.
Sure. I mean, I think when I think about the reason why I wanted to pursue architecture, it's because I came from sort of a political science, like history buff background, and I realized that the built environment, it's sort of the physical artifacts of our culture and of our desires. So in order to change the way we live, we have to change cultural attitudes. And maybe this is done through fostering transparency and institutional accountability, but also through the expansion of the range of ideas in design, and to really empower diverse and critical voices, such as fostering cross-disciplinary collaboration among different networks and across different territories as well. Over the summer, something that I've been really interested in is sort of the explosion of sort of this digital way of learning. And there was so much knowledge that I saw being shared across social media. Like people were reaching out for me for like reading lists. My Google Drive is just bookmarks of like hundreds of folders of PDFs that people sent me. And then also the development of alternative curriculums. There's a group called Black Voices in the City, which is based out of Canada. It's made by students, and what they did is create a database of writings and research by Black urbanists in order to forefront their stories and their work in urban discourse. So there's a lot of, I think, propensity to have this education be more decentralized, and I think that offers a lot of opportunity to explore. The other thing that I was thinking about is sort of the necessity to re-articulate the role of the profession. So it's grounded in a real sort of professional ethos that we sort of, in the pursuit of architecture or design or planning, we know why we want to do it, because design for so long has been this handmaiden of capitalism and colonialism, and whether it admits to that or not, it's complicit in designing sort of insufferable ways of living. So with that, there's a real urgency, I think, to find more democratic ways of operating in the political economy. And this could start in universities, where we take this opportunity to use it as a forum to raise political and social awareness of the consequences that come out of design, and ways of working that are more just and more participatory and democratic. I liked what Wandile said earlier about how everyone is an architect, because we all ascribe meaning to things and build up the world in ways that suit our circumstances. And I wanted to finish off by this quote I liked from an interface designer. And he says, more often than not, the most meaningful human activity boils down to providing support structure for one another. In turn, the most meaningful designed output is the infrastructural. So this is from a designer named Edward Urquades. And yeah, those are my reflections on today's event.
Thank you, Vivian. So to all our participants, I need just 5 more minutes of your time. I realize that we've reached the 2-hour mark, but again, I want to thank our panelists, Craig, Wandile, Martina, and Vivian. Thank you so much for your really thought-provoking, insightful perspectives. I think I myself, and I'm sure the participants as well, have come with a host of new questions, some answers, but perhaps even more questions as to how we can move forward. And before the final remarks, we, and when I say we, I say the University of Calgary School of Architecture, Landscape Planning and Landscape, we have a surprise announcement that we would like to share with all of you. Following in the spirit and the ethos of this panel, right? Soliciting voices, hearing from different people, and trying to find ways, right, to search for the answers that we're looking for, to search for how we can continue to move forward in a productive manner. And things having become even more complex given the current health crisis, right, the energy crisis, climate change, economic downturns. So we are formally launching called CBDX Cities for All, an international design ideas competition. So this international design ideas competition, the first in what will be the CBDX series, asks, what does a city for all look like? How does it operate and function? How can it come into being? What place, structure, thing, system, process, or relationship must be forged to engender a more just and equitable city for all? And in particular, this perhaps the most crucial question, this competition will ask, how are these aims navigated by, through, and with the current uncertainty brought by the ongoing global pandemic and the long-term existential threats of environmental degradation and climate change? So this competition will ask entrants to consider how matters of equity and activism, ecology and environment, and health and wellness might converge and unfold within our future cities. So it's my distinct pleasure and honor to be formally introducing and announcing this competition to all of you. I encourage you to visit cbdxcitiesforall.com. The competition will formally launch on October 1st, but all of you that have stayed with us the entire 2 hours can sign up right now for a discount on the registration. We really want to hear how all of you are thinking about what cities can be and how they can begin to enact change, following on the threads and the conversations that Craig, Wandile, Martina, and Vivian have also insightfully highlighted for us. So just to give you some quick information, the next lecture in the Pan-Canada Lecture Series 2020-2021 will be hosted by the University of Manitoba. The date is yet to be decided, but please visit the University of Manitoba.ca/architecture for additional details. Also, a recording of this lecture will be available on our website for 1 week for those of you who are in a different time zone or weren't able to stay for the whole thing. I want to thank again our sponsors, Carson and McCullough and EXP, for really allowing us to facilitate this panel. And again, I want to thank Wandile, Craig, Martina, and Vivian for inspiring and challenging us. And as a last note, there will be a Zoom poll that you can fill out to sort of indicate, how satisfied you were with today's program. So I would welcome all of your participation. But again, thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure to host this panel, and we hope to hear all of your thoughts and all of your perspectives through this competition that we've launched, which to us is really an additional commitment to find and highlight the voices and the sort of things that I think we need to move forward. So again, thank you so much, Wandile, Craig, Martina, and Vivian,